In Chapter 2, we'll talk about the U.S. Constitution, which is really a remarkable document. It's quite short, depicts very broad principles, but has stood the test of time. It's remained largely intact in the 200 plus years since it was adopted. Take a brief look quickly at some of the background into what went into framing the Constitution. First, the colonial background. 1607, English government sent a group of people to establish a trading post in Jamestown, and the king gave those backers full power and authority to make laws. As a result, the colonists set up a representative assembly, which was a legislature made up of individuals representing the population. First New England colony came as a result of the Mayflower. People coming over on the Mayflower wanted to practice their own religious beliefs and dissatisfied with the Church of England. So they came up, right before they landed, came up with the Mayflower Compact, which wasn't really a constitution, but a political statement that set forth the idea of consent of affected individuals. Pilgrim beliefs at that time, they were committed to self-government, although the political ideals were very different from what we embrace today, or even when the Constitution was written. The Pilgrims had formed a religious colony with no attempt to separate church or state. By 1732, 13 colonies had been established, and legislation that had been passed in those colonies, for example, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, gave colonists political experience that they would use later. Once the colonies were established by the 1760s, the British Parliament began to pass tax laws that treated the colonies as one, as a unit, and they were taxing them largely to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. For example, 1764 passed the sugar tax. Colonists protested. 1765, Stamp Act. Colonists were saying this was taxation without representation. They boycotted English products. And 2 years later, more taxes led to the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded to the Tea Party by closing the Boston Harbor and placing the Massachusetts government under British rule, and with that, the colonists had really had enough. So in response to the actions from Britain, the colonists decided to have a Congress that involved delegates from all the colonies. First Continental Congress, 1774, not really to claim independence, but the attendees wanted to petition the king with a list of grievances, and they resolved to raise troops in each colony and to boycott British trade. These actions were seen by the Crown as acts of rebellion. The Second Continental Congress, by the time of this 1775 gathering took place, fighting had already begun between the British and the colonists. Main focus of this Congress: establish an army, declare George Washington the commander-in-chief. And also at that time, Thomas Paine's pamphlet reflected popular opinion in plain language, and it really rallied colonists to form their own government. In 1776, in April, the Second Continental Congress voted for trade policies that implied independence. And by May, it directed colonies to establish their independence by forming their own state governments. By June, Thomas Jefferson began writing drafts of the Resolution of Independence. That was adopted July 2nd. Finally, on July 4th, Declaration of Independence was accepted. The Declaration of Independence had a couple of very critical ideals. One, the ideal of universal truths, that all men are created equal, and that the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Declaration also had what was a revolutionary idea of natural rights, and that reflected the arguments of the English philosopher John Locke, who wrote that rights are inherent in natural law and not dependent on government, and it also that there was a social contract, which was a voluntary agreement among individuals to secure their rights and welfare by creating a government and abiding by its rules. The Declaration of Independence was significant for a couple of reasons. That while Abraham Lincoln, later argued that they had no practical value in separating from Britain, that a couple of important points. The Declaration of Independence set up ideals that are part of the national identity and also established the legitimacy of the new nation to foreign nations. And we saw a rise of republicanism, not the Republican Party, but what it was is the Republicans at that time became a major political force that they opposed rule by any central authority. And as each state adopted its own constitution, they pushed for increased power to state legislatures. So at that time, that in almost all the states, the legislature was the dominant branch. And when the Articles of Confederation were developed, they were developed in an atmosphere where there was a fear of a too powerful government. So these Articles of Confederation allowed one vote for each state, appointed an executive committee to carry out laws, and regulated foreign affairs. And here are some of the powers of the Congress of the Confederation. You can see the powers they had, the powers they don't have. You can review those on your own schedule. And here are some of the accomplishments under the Articles. That there were certain states that gave up their land claims in the West, so settled disputes between states over the Western territorial lands. And the Northwest Ordinance set up a pattern of government for new territories. And for the first time, resources were pooled by American states. A couple of the weaknesses of the Articles: Congress couldn't demand revenues from the states, and its actions required the consent of states. There's really no central authority and no national system of courts. And most importantly, there was no power to raise funds for the militia, for a militia. As you can see, 9 out of 13 states had to approve the actions of the Articles Congress and unanimous consent to amend the Articles. One of the key occurrences was Shays' Rebellion. It was an uprising by a band of armed farmers, and that convinced political leaders that the central government under the Articles was incapable of maintaining order or providing for the public welfare. And the solution as a result of Shays' Rebellion appeared to be a stronger central government. So in going about to draft the Constitution, that the September 1786 meeting of all state really addressed the multiple weaknesses and lapses in the central government relating to states and its legislatures. And what they did was petition Continental Congress for a convention to address the needs of the national government. There were a couple of different factions among delegates. Most delegates favored a stronger government. There's no agreement on structure or strength. The majority of the delegates were strong nationalists, seeking a powerful central government. It was George Washington and Benjamin Franklin in that group. But there were some other delegates who opposed a strong national government, and some were totally against any national authority. So that required some politicking and compromises, and the convention was started from the point of Edmund Randolph from the Virginia delegation, ready to present 15 resolutions proposing fundamental changes in the national government, or for the nation's government. This set the tone for the remainder of the convention. Here were some of the plans. The Virginia plan was based on a bicameral legislature, power concentrated in a lower chamber chosen by the people, which would then choose the smaller upper chamber. The legislature would elect an unspecified national executive and appoint a national judiciary. But representation would be strictly by population, and that would be a disadvantage to smaller states. The New Jersey plan maintained the one state, one vote structure that was already in place. Several people would comprise the executive office to be elected by Congress, and that office would support a Supreme Court. The New Jersey plan, one of the key elements was the supremacy document, and that gives priority of national law over state laws. That's a doctrine which was later included in the Constitution, and that's a doctrine that continues. Supremacy doctrine gives priority of national law over state laws. The Great Compromise, Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed a compromise between the more populous states, which wanted representation based on population, and the small states, which wanted representation equal for each state. So the Great Compromise proposed a bicameral legislature, one chamber based on population, House of Representatives, and the other based on equal representation for each state, the Senate. That's the plan that broke the deadlock between large and small states, and that's a system that we see at work today, with the House of Representatives based on population, Senate based on equal representation for each state. And finally, the 3/5 compromise related to serious doubts that some delegates had about slavery. That delegates from the South opposed any ban and wanted slaves to be opposed the ban on slavery and wanted slaves to be counted in determining representation. Delegates from the North objected. And what we found with the 3/5 compromise, that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted, or each slave would count as 3/5 of the person. So the matter of slavery itself was put off until early 1800, but whether the framers should have banned slavery rather than accept the compromise has been debated by historians ever since. There were some other issues that were resolved at the convention. Basically, the U.S. government would not tax exports. Congress could regulate trade between states and with foreign nations. I also created a Supreme Court, with Congress establishing lower federal courts.